Greetings everyone and welcome to this session of your gastrointestinal system course. I'm Dr. Sally and today we're going to be covering the blood supply of the GIT. And so this is basically a summary of the things that we're going to be covering for this session. We're going to look at the embryological arrangement of the GIT. You guys know how it's divided into different parts, so we're just going to go through those. We're going to look at the sources of arterial supply to the GIT, and we're going to look at the branches that come from those different main arteries. And then we're just going to touch really quickly on the portal venous system, and then just kind of like wrap up the session with that. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing you need to be familiar with is the embryological arrangement of the GIT. Based on the development of the gastrointestinal tract, you know that it has three distinct divisions, which are called the foregut, midgut, and the hindgut. Now, each of these divisions is characterized by two things. Number one, it has a specific starting and ending point. Okay, so it starts somewhere, and then it ends somewhere. And then usually the ending point of one division is the beginning of the second division. So basically where the foregut ends, the midgut begins, and so forth. And the other importance of this embryological arrangement is that each of these divisions has its own arterial supply, and usually there isn't any overlap. So wherever the foregut ends, it's going to be limited to a certain artery, and then the midgut is going to be limited to a certain artery, and so forth. Okay? So this picture is just demonstrating the starting and ending points and the different organs that are contained within the various divisions of the GIT. So they've given you the foregut in this kind of like pink color. Okay, and then they've given you all the parts of the midgut in like this kind of orange. And then finally this brown part is going to give you the hindgut. And then they've shown you how the abdominal aorta gives off different arteries to each part. So you've got one artery coming over here to the foregut. You've got another artery coming here to the midgut, and then the third one coming to the hindgut. Okay, so that's just demonstrating the whole point of each one having its own starting and ending point, and each one having its own arterial supply. Okay, so we're going to go into the details of each of those separately. Okay, so the arteries that supply the gastrointestinal tract are what we call anterior branches of the abdominal aorta. So if you look at the abdominal aorta here, it passes down the midline in front of the vertebral column, and you can see that it has three branches or three arteries coming out of its anterior surface. So we call these the anterior branches of the abdominal aorta, and these are the ones that are responsible for supplying the GIT. So let's start with the blood supply of the foregut. The foregut is essentially the beginning of the GIT. For description purposes, we're going to say that it extends between the distal ends of the esophagus. It does comprise higher parts, but we're not going to get into that today. Okay, so we're going to take it from the distal ends of the esophagus until the second part of the duodenum where the bile and pancreatic ducts enter. So basically at the level of the ampulla of Vater or the major duodenal papilla, that's going to be the end of the foregut. So therefore the organs that are contained or considered part of the foregut are the distal end of the esophagus, the stomach, the first part of the duodenum, as well as the upper half of the second part. And we also count in the pancreas, the liver, and the biliary system. The foregut receives its blood supply from something called the celiac artery. The celiac artery is the highest anterior branch of the abdominal aorta, and it arises at the vertebral level of T12. So we're going to go back to our picture of the abdominal aorta, and the highest branch is this one here. This is the celiac artery. Okay, and like I said, it arises at the level of T12. Alright, so what you're looking at here is just a detailed picture of the different parts of the celiac trunk. I've mentioned before that the celiac trunk is a relatively small um, artery, and then as soon as it comes out of the abdominal aorta, it just immediately divides into its branches, which are the left gastric artery here. This is this one. All right. And then running along the upper part of the pancreas, you've got the splenic artery going towards the spleen. And then here we've got the common hepatic artery, okay, which if you follow it upwards towards the liver, you're going to notice that it splits into a right, into a right and left hepatic arteries right there, okay? So the branches that come from the celiac artery, like I said, are the left gastric artery. This one supplies the lower part of the esophagus and parts of the stomach. The splenic artery also supplies part of the stomach. It supplies the spleen, and it supplies the majority of the pancreas. And the hepatic artery also supplies part of the stomach. If you want to go back to that lecture and review it, the hepatic artery also supplies the liver, the biliary system, the upper part of the duodenum, and it also gives branches to the head of the pancreas, okay, through its various branches, all right, so that wraps up the foregut. Let's move on to the blood supply of the midgut, and remember, the end point of one gastrointestinal division is the starting point of the next one, so therefore, the midgut begins where the foregut ends. And it extends from the second part of the duodenum below the ampulla of Vater, and it will end at the junction between, this is going to be a little bit confusing, so I need you to focus, okay? It ends at the junction between the proximal 2/3, which is basically the right 2/3 of the transverse colon, and the distal 1/3. So basically, you take the entire transverse colon as it extends across the abdomen, and you divide it into 2/3 and 1/3. The 2/3 that are found on the right side are usually referred to as the proximal 2/3, because if you follow the intestine, those are going to be the first 2/3 that you find. And then the third that's on the left side, that's usually referred to as the distal one. So you can use either description. You can call it the right or proximal. You can call it the distal or left. Nobody is going to tell you that you're wrong. Okay, but I just wanted to put in both terms here so that you can just differentiate between them. Okay, so the organs that are considered the midgut are the rest of the duodenum, so basically the lower second part, the third part of the fourth part, the coils of the small intestine, so the jejunum and the ileum. We also consider the appendix, the cecum, the ascending colon, and the first or proximal 2/3 of the transverse colon. These are all the organs that are considered part of the midgut. Now, the midgut is supplied by the superior mesenteric artery. This is the second anterior branch of the abdominal aorta, and it arises at the level of L1. Okay, so we're going to look at the superior mesenteric artery here, and you can see that it's found right underneath the celiac trunk, and that's your superior mesenteric artery. Okay, so here we're just looking at the superior mesenteric artery and how it's giving off all of its branches to the different parts of the midgut. Okay, so if we look at it first here, okay, we can see that it's giving off some branches to the duodenum. Okay, sorry, my bad. All right, and then here, these are the coils of the jejunum and the ileum, so you can see that it's giving off a whole bunch of branches to these arteries that are passing through the mesentery of the small intestine. It also, if you look here, you can see that it's giving off branches to the cecum. Okay, there's a couple of branches coming into the appendix and the terminal ileum here. And then you've got these two arteries, this one and this one, okay? These are going to the ascending colon and the transverse colon. These are called the colic arteries, okay? These are usually referred to as the intestinal branches. And then the ones that supply the terminal ileum, the cecum, and the appendix, that's usually called the ileocolic artery. Okay, so you've got a bunch of branches that come out of the superior mesenteric that end up supplying the different parts of the midgut. So the branches of the superior mesenteric artery are, number one, the inferior pancreaticoduodenal, which we've already seen before, that ends up going to the duodenum and pancreas. The intestinal branches are usually supplying the jejunum and the ileum. You might find them in certain places referred to as the jejunal and ileal branches. That's totally fine. You've got the ileocholic artery, which supplies the terminal ileum, so the last part of the ileum just before it enters the cecum. The ileocholic artery also gives off branches to the cecum as well as the appendix. And you've got the right colic artery that supplies the ascending colon, and the middle colic artery that supplies the proximal transverse colon. Okay? So while you're studying, keep the picture of the branches open and then try to identify each one. Alright, so we're going to move on to the last part of the blood supply, which is the hindgut. Okay, and again, the hindgut is going to, the hindgut will begin where the midgut ends, and therefore it starts at the junction of the transverse colon between, so the distal 1/3 or the left 1/3 of the transverse colon, and it will end at the junction of the upper and lower halves of the anal canal. Okay? So organs that are found or considered part of the hindgut are the distal part of the transverse colon, so that last 1/3, the descending and sigmoid colons, the rectum, and the upper half of the anal canal. The hindgut is supplied by the inferior mesenteric artery, which is the last anterior branch of the abdominal aorta, and it arises at the level of L3. So that is going to be your inferior mesenteric artery. It's the last one, and like I said, it supplies the hindgut. Okay, so here, this picture includes a couple of branches from the superior mesenteric artery as well. You can ignore those. And if you focus here, with the inferior mesenteric artery, you're going to notice that it gives off branches that are going to supply the left or distal 1/3 of the transverse colon, as well as the descending colon here. Okay, and then it gives off a whole network of arteries that ends up supplying the sigmoid colon as well. And then finally, it continues as an artery that ends up going to the rectum. Okay? So the arteries or branches that come out of the inferior mesenteric artery are the left colic artery, that's the one that supplies the transverse and descending colons. You've got the sigmoid or sigmoidal branches to the sigmoid colon, so those are going to be easy to remember. And then it ends or continues as the superior rectal artery. So the inferior mesenteric artery doesn't technically terminate as branches, it just continues as a single artery, and you just basically change the name depending on where it is. So as soon as it enters or reaches the rectum, you're going to refer to it as the superior rectal artery. Okay, so that wraps up the blood supply. Okay, make sure you know the starting and ending points of each division of the GIT, and make sure you can name the different branches that come from the arteries that supply the different divisions. Okay, and like I said, the last thing we're going to go through is the portal venous system. We're going to look at that really quickly. Venous blood returning from the GIT needs to pass through the liver first. Okay, so normally you've seen how venous blood just kind of drains from the organ into the veins and then goes directly back to the heart. This doesn't happen in the GIT. The blood needs to drain into the liver first, and then the liver will carry it to the inferior vena cava, which will then carry it back to the heart. Okay, and the reason for this is because the blood from the GIT needs to be processed first. It needs to be detoxified if there's anything that needs to be removed, if there are any nutrients or excess nutrients that need to be stored, and things like that. Okay, so there's like this whole processing event that occurs in the liver. Okay, so all the venous blood of the GIT drains into a specific vein that passes into the liver, and this is called the portal vein. The portal vein is formed by the splenic and superior mesenteric veins joining together, and this happens behind the neck of the pancreas. The splenic vein receives venous tributaries that correspond to the branches of the splenic artery. So basically, it receives veins from the spleen, it receives veins from the stomach, it receives veins from the pancreas, and then just basically drains all those organs. Okay, so basically think of the splenic vein as the drainage of the foregut. All right. It also receives the inferior mesenteric vein. Okay, so the inferior mesenteric vein drains separately into the splenic vein, and it drains all the regions that are supplied by the inferior mesenteric artery. So basically, the distal transverse colon, the descending colon, the sigmoid colon, all of those places are going to be drained by the inferior mesenteric vein. And anything that is supplied by the superior mesenteric artery will obviously be drained by the superior mesenteric vein. So here, this is just basically how the portal vein is formed, okay? So you've got the superior mesenteric artery here. This is the superior mesenteric vein next to it. And you can clearly see that it's receiving veins from the various parts of the gut. Okay, so these are from the duodenum. This is from the ascending colon and so forth. Okay? Passing across here, this is the splenic vein. Alright? So it's going to receive all the venous drainage, or most of the venous drainage, from the foregut. Alright, so the splenic vein passes transversely here. Sorry. It joins with the superior mesenteric vein, and this is basically going to be the region of the neck of the pancreas. And then up here, this is the portal vein. Alright? If we go back down, you can see that all of these veins from the hindgut are draining into this single vein here. This is the inferior mesenteric vein. And if we follow the inferior mesenteric vein upwards, you can clearly see that it's draining into the splenic vein right there. Okay? So, as a reading assignment for you guys, I want you to go find out what are the portosystemic anastomoses. Okay? You're going to find out that there is a communication between the portal vein and certain systemic veins in the body. Alright? So I want you to go read about that, and then hopefully I will either do a discussion session or we'll do a discussion forum. I mean, we'll figure something out for this exercise, okay? So make sure you go read that. And I am going to wrap up this session now. I hope that it was useful for you, and as always, I'm available for questions if you have any, and I will see you guys next session.